This poem, The Book in the Snow by Edna St. Vincent Millay, is probably one of my favourite poems ever, I think. And I do a lot of poems, so that's saying something. She's a really amazing poet, so if you like this poem, I recommend going and reading other poems by her. Read about her life. She's really crazy. Read about her interests and her, her themes and her way of living. It's very, very interesting. But yeah, this one, The Book in the Snow, it's a complex poem at first, and it's a bit difficult to understand what it's about. So the story is quite straightforward. There's basically a buck, a male deer, and a doe, a female deer. They're in an apple orchard. They jump over a fence into a hemlock grove. So it's sort of snow, winter time. There's all these dark kind of bushes called hemlocks. They're like kind of in between a tree and a bush. And they run into those, and it's kind of like an ominous foreshadowing because hemlocks are quite dark, symbolic things. They symbolize witchcraft, dark magic, that kind of thing. And then 1 minute later, the buck is suddenly dead and he's on the ground and his blood is sort of bleeding and spilling out into the snow. And the doe is a mile away. She's kind of run and she's looking back at the buck who's dead. So it's, a really beautiful natural image at first. That's this kind of couple, this animal couple going for a nice little walk in an apple orchard. And then it becomes tragic and kind of violent and dramatic because the male deer ends up dead. The female sort of run away and is looking back in shock. So yeah, that story is kind of simple and quite easy to follow. It's quite almost classical, like it feels like an ancient Greek story. You get a lot of ancient Greek stories about deer in forests and hunting and tragic deaths and symbolism and that kind of thing. So for me, it feels like quite classical type poem. And straightforward to kind of understand. The difficulty is not the understanding it so much as the kind of accessing the deeper meanings and the messages of it. So I'm going to go through some of those with you today. So firstly, with the poem, if you've not read it already, I recommend having a look. So I'll just put it up for you here. Read it aloud because it's got really strong sounds to it. So you can pause the video, read it aloud to yourself, maybe read it a few times and see if you notice anything in particular, if anything sort of sticks out to you. I think my favourite part is I saw them suddenly go, tails up with long leaps, lovely and slow. Just such a really beautiful way to express the movement of the deer as they kind of jump and move gracefully through the snow. You might notice some lines are really short, some are much longer. So the point where the buck dies here, bringing to his antlers the buck in the snow, we would call this a hypometric line, HYPO, metric line, because it looks deliberately short and it's symbolizing the fact that his life's been cut short, that he's fallen at this point in the poem. You might notice the monostic, which is a single line stanza in the center of the poem, which separates the moment between the past when the buck and deer were alive and now when the buck is dead and the doe is kind of run away. So structurally, it's very complex and very precise. Like she knows exactly what she's doing with every full stop and every length of line, every sound of the poem. A lot of students always ask me, did the writer really mean to put that in? Do they really think that that's what we're going to get out of the poem? And it is easy from a reader's viewpoint to think, I'm just reading too much into the poem. But some writers, when they're really accomplished, you can tell that they know every single full stop mattered or every single word they've thought really carefully about. And Shakespeare's like that. So if you ever read Shakespeare, you'll notice how much he cares about every little single thing that he puts into his work. Edna St. Vincent Millay is another one. So she's a master poet. She really knows exactly what she's doing with every little precise detail of her poem. So you might notice when there's a dash here, letting fall a feather of snow, that's deliberate, and it shows the kind of quick drop of snow that looks like a feather falling from the hemlock trees. So yeah, you can pause, read the poem aloud if you want. If you're ready to move on, we're going to go a little bit deeper into the language of the poem. And hopefully you're enjoying it, because I think it's really beautiful. It's quite sad, this one, but it's just like really emotional and powerful. This is just a little drawing that we found. There's basically like hemlock twigs, so you can kind of see a little bit more how they look. But yeah, hemlock trees, they're always associated with black magic, witchcraft. Here I kind of talk about how they're symbolic of dark magic, so it's a sort of ominous foreshadowing that something bad will happen. We don't know if it's some kind of ritualistic sacrifice, like some kind of magical occult sacrifice, or if it's just a regular hunt. I kind of assume it's a regular hunt, and it's something to do with a hunter who's absent from the poem, but he's shot the buck. But yeah, you could possibly interpret it as well as something a bit more ritualistic. So it's important that we see the buck alive one moment and then dead the next. We're given entirely the perspective of the animals in this poem. We're not given the human perspective. The speaker is obviously a human and a silent observer, but the other potential human in the poem, the person who kills the buck, is not at all present as a figure. So it creates what we call pathos, which is a tragic device. You find it in a lot of tragic writing, even ancient Greek classical tragedy. It means pity, sympathy. So we have extreme sympathy for the living doe who's still alive, who's watched her partner die, who's having to kind of carry on in life in a difficult time of year in winter without her partner, and has run away, but is also looking back at where her buck has been killed. So yeah, there's tons of language features. If you want to go more into those, you can have a look on the scribbly.com website. There's full courses that I've done on these poems there, and they go really into detail with analysis. I always try and keep my videos to about 10 minutes so that it's not boring. So I'm going to skip through the language. Feel free to pause and kind of have a look through the language yourself as well if you want at this point. I'm going to focus more on structure, I think, with her, because I just think that one of her poetic geniuses, one of the things that makes her a great poet, is really her control over structure. And one thing that's really interesting that I'll give you as a task is to think about the rhyming of this poem. It's very strange. So we have a quintet, which is a 5-line stanza, all rhyming completely. So it's A, 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 A. So every single line rhymes with every other. And then there's a monostic, which is a single line stanza, which also rhymes with that quintet. So it stands out visually on the page, but in terms of sound, it still connects to that quintet. And then the rhyme breaks down and it becomes more fragmented, but it ends with a rhyming couplet. So it's a bizarre choice for rhyme. She's writing in a time when rhyme is actually falling out of popularity. People aren't really bothering to make rhyming poems anymore. So even the kind of sounds, the rhyming sounds of the poem would sound weird to a contemporary reader of Millay. She actually got criticised for being too old-fashioned in her time sometimes. So she liked the kind of older Victorian style of poetry quite a lot, which was heavy on rhyme. So yeah, you might want to pause, read through the poem a little bit, think about the rhyming structure and how that connects to the meaning of the lines and what's going on at the different moments of the story. And think about why she chose to end the poem with a rhyming couplet especially. You might want to research rhyming couplets and see what they're used for in poetry, because they have a very specific meaning. So structurally as well, another thing, once you've done that, if you pause and manage to do that one, structurally as well, there's a Volta. So Volta is a turning point, and it shows a really dramatic shift in something in the poem. So there's a huge shift here from past tense, when the creatures were both alive, to present tense, where the buck is dead and the doe is separated. And so there's a shift to the present moment from the past. There's a shift in tense, shift in perspective, a jump in time, and also a slight shift in almost kind of mood or topic, we could say, because the original part of the story is just, telling the story of these deer and what happens to them. But the second part of the story that you see in the sextet, the 6-line stanza at the end, becomes more abstract and philosophical. It's less about these characters, the buck and the doe, and it's more about the abstract ideas of life and death, and it makes the speaker reflect on her own beliefs about life and death. So she kind of has these sort of shocking epiphanies, these moments of clarity, these moments of breakthrough in her head where this kind of shocking, tragic experience happens to her, and she thinks death is such a strange thing. It just brings this creature who is strong and alive to his knees, and in a second he's gone. But life is also a really strange thing, because the doe is still alive, and the doe is looking back at the death of her partner. And so the buck ends up representing death, and the doe represents life. And there's almost a dialogue or a communication, like a tension between those two things, which I think is really beautiful and really interesting and kind of thought-provoking as well. So she repeats this phrase, how strange a thing. So she gets really fixated on the strangeness of it, not necessarily the strangeness of the specific event, but the strangeness of life and death, and the kind of thin veil that separates those, the way that you could slip from being alive to being dead very quickly. It's a bit morbid, it's kind of dark, but I think quite interesting and quite thought-provoking. So yeah, a little bit about Edna St. Vincent Millay. This is my favourite photograph of her. She's really beautiful and just a really cool person. She's surrounded by magnolia flowers here. And yeah, she's just interesting, strange lady, very unusual background. She grew up in a rural environment, and she was quite poor, but her mum always carried a suitcase of Shakespeare and Milton and famous writers around wherever they travelled, and would just read it to her as a child and to her sisters. So yeah, since she was little, she always had this love of literature. And she lived in a rural setting, in a rural environment, and you can see a lot of that influencing her poetry and her interest in nature. But contrastingly with that, she also moved to Greenwich Village in New York, which is obviously a huge, super busy city. And she became a socialite, so she moved in literary circles and became a famous writer there. So she has this contrast between city and country as well in her psyche, which is interesting. Really, really amazing poem, if you like Edna St. Vincent Millay, that I'd recommend. It's called First Fig, and it's so short. It's so famous that you might have heard it. It's very often read at funerals, actually, I think, because it's about how you choose to spend your life and different kinds of people and the way that they choose to exist. And yeah, it's just a beautiful poem. So First Fig, if you feel like reading another Millay, I'd recommend that one. So yeah, her house in where her family settled, or her mother settled after she divorced her father, was between the mountains and the sea. There's baskets of apples and drying herbs on the porch, mingling their scents with those of the neighbouring pine woods. I found this in a little article about Millay and her life, and I just felt like it really, that image and that type of landscape really does chime well with the Buck in the Snow. So you can kind of imagine the type of world that she grew up in. Again, if you want to do further research, have a look at some images of Camden, Maine, and just see what kind of environment it looks like there, because you'll be able to help picture her poems in more detail. So a couple of attitudes just to finish then. We've gone through this one a little bit. Life and death are complex and mysterious phenomena. They're worth pondering, thinking about, developing your own opinions on. You might want to compare and contrast your beliefs about life and death with the beliefs in the poem. I feel like it's quite an atheistic poem in a way, because it doesn't have a sense of like afterlife or necessarily spirituality to it. It's a very mundane perspective. The speaker is looking at it from the point of view of one moment the buck is conscious, the next moment he's not. There's no sense of a soul or continuation of anything. So if you are a religious or spiritual person, you might have a really different reaction to the poem as well. But yeah, the idea that existence is uncanny, it's a really strange thing to just suddenly be born and be conscious and alive. I think regardless of your religious or spiritual beliefs or lack thereof, we almost can all agree that feels kind of bizarre in a way. Even though it's a morbid poem about death, these types of poems are intended to help you live life more fully and experience life more kind of in a present sense, so you feel more alive by being conscious of the fact that life is precious and that people do die, and that we're not here forever. The more that you think like that, the more you actually really try hard to enjoy your life and make something of it. So I think for me, the poem definitely had this type of effect. It made me really appreciate existence a lot. There's a sense of separation as well between two partners. You could read it as a kind of love poem, and the idea that the buck is no longer able to provide or care for the doe has to be independent, might relate to some of Millay's own personal beliefs as well. And then the final ones, the reevaluating our perspective, is just kind of what I went over there. This one is interesting. So this is more an eco-critical perspective. It's about nature. So we could see it as a comment on humans and the environment. So there's a human has sort of disturbed the natural peace of this world, especially if you're interested in environmental kind of like, conservation issues or that type of thing. You might want to evaluate your beliefs about hunting, your ideas on hunting, but there's a sense that there's this kind of perfect harmony of the natural world, which is in balance. There's the doe and the deer. There's the apple orchard, which perhaps represents something like the Garden of Eden, which is an idyllic state of existence that is sort of perfect and, complete in itself. And then there's this random thing that happens and suddenly the buck is dead and we assume that's a hunter. So it's almost like a symbolism for humans in the way that they intrude upon and interfere with the natural mechanisms of the world. So yeah, you can think about nature and environmentalism as well in relation to this poem. It's quite an interesting way to read the poem. So yeah, there's some kind of questions and tasks here if you feel like doing... I'm still not used to these things. If you feel like doing a little bit more work on it. And hopefully this poem's made you think loads. You really enjoyed it and feel a lot more confident on it. So yeah, I've really enjoyed this lesson. So hopefully you guys have too. And thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon. If you want any more resources, you're welcome to go to the scribbly.com website, and we've got downloadable documents and videos and all kinds of things on there. So yeah, thank you for listening. I'll see you soon.